The President, please be seated. The court is now back in session. We would like to proceed with the co-prosecutor to put further questions to the witness. You may now proceed.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Now, prior to the lunch break, I had read out a first passage from Philip Short's novel, Pol Pot, Anatomy of a Nightmare. Mr. Witness, can you please just repeat to us what you told us about the printing office and about how documents were printed by the Maquis and how those documents were delivered by the messengers? I'd also like to have your reaction with respect to the footnote that I had read out earlier on, in which it states that you had worked from 1967 to mid-1968 at the printing office of the Maquis before the printing office was transferred to Ratanakiri. Can you please confirm to us whether or not you worked there from 1967 to 1968? And if you worked at Ratanakiri printing documents?
Response, Mr. President. This question involves the interview conducted with me, and I cannot remember the details. In the interview, I sometimes talked about things I heard from other people or the words of mouth. And I do not know much about the responsibility. And the interview was conducted in private, and my response is more private as well. When asked whether I was engaged in the movement, I said, as an educated person, I played some parts in that process, and the locations of the office changed in accordance with the situation during the war. For example, if at one place it was not secure, then we would move to another. When it comes to the printing house, it refers to the printing means. For example, this printing method was mobile. We packed everything in a backpack where we could print some documents.
For the sake of clarification, you said that all the material was held in a backpack and you had everything you needed for printing purposes. Therefore, was it your job to print documents during the period that preceded the coup d'etat that was staged in March 1970?
Response. As a person who was in charge of writing, the person had to have a very good handwriting, and the handwriting would then be reproduced through printing, and this is how the process took place.
Est-ce que c'est vous qui écrivez?
Were you the ones who drafted those documents? You were saying that it was somebody who had nice handwriting, so were you the one penning those documents, or was it somebody else?
Response. I perhaps did not make it clear. I was the one who helped with the printing. I did not write the text. Someone else who had the very fine writing did it.
D'accord.
Very well. So you're telling us that you worked in Siem Reap for approximately 1 year from 1966 to 1967. Following that, you traveled in the capacity of printer, as somebody who held the printing job, in the northeastern region of the country.
Response. Mr. President, with regard to the printing job, it was done at the central zone near in the vicinity of Kampong Cham province and close to the northwest zone.
Est-ce qu'à un moment donné,
At one point or another, as Mr. Philip Short seems to suggest, was the printing office transferred from the central zone to the northeastern zone?
Response. I think you could have been mistaken. The document I referred to was not the document from the upper echelon. The documents were classified into sectors, and we had to have them printed in their respective sectors. And if in that location there was a chaotic situation or the fighting was taking place, then we would move to another location where printing could take place.
quels étaient ceux...
What kind of documents were being printed? What kind of documents were being printed and then would be delivered from one location to another?
Response. These documents obtained from the upper echelon, then they would be passed down to sector. The sector will ask people concerned to have them printed and broadcast to the location at the battlefield and the surrounding areas near the battlefields. These documents were not mainly the original, the documents from the top. It had to go through some layers, and the content of the documents were about educating people at the rear to work, to do farming, to improve production, and that the people at the rear were encouraged or educated to bring the crops, the yields and food supplies in particular to people in the front for the revolution or for the struggle purpose.
You were telling us that these documents emanated from the upper echelon. Who occupied the upper echelon from 1966 to 1967, or 1965 rather, to 67, and how were those documents sent to Siem Reap, if I'm not mistaken?
Response. These documents were sent through branches who then passed them on to others. So the head of each branch who received the documents would contribute the documents to other people concerned, but I don't know who they were.
Est-ce que c'était des documents?
Were these official documents of the Communist Party of Kampuchea?
Response. To my understanding, the documents belong to the front. They did not specifically say that they were about the Communist Party of Cambodia. They were mainly documents about the front.
À votre connaissance,
To the best of your knowledge, where were the leaders of the CPK between 1967 to 1970? Where in the country were they taking refuge while they were serving in the Maquis?
Response. These people would take refuge in the places not known to me, because it was part of the secrecy that had to be kept.
je vais maintenant lire un deuxième.
I wish now to quote another passage from the same book that I referenced earlier, Philip Short's book. On page 00396393, and on French ERN page 00639706, Philip Short talks about the very strict discipline that reigned within the communist movement, and I quote, Sun Sen's younger brother, Nikan, spent 3 months holed up in a peasant's hut in rural Kampong Cham while he was on the run in 1968. He was not allowed to go outside to wash or even to use a latrine, ostensibly for security reasons, but in fact to temper him, enabling him to prove that his loyalty to the party had no limit. End of quote. This is on page 193 of the English version. Mr. Witness, do you confirm having spent those 3 months in Kampong Cham in the countryside in 1968 while you were in hiding?
Response. I was in hiding, as I indicated in the interview. Indeed, I was trying to escape. The country was in crisis. The coup d'etat happened, and it was quite confusing internally. And as a person who was in charge of propaganda, I could have been implicated, and I had to be in hiding along with other teachers, and that happened for sure.
Là, je parle.
I'm actually talking about 1968. I'm not referring to the period that followed the coup d'etat. Was it in 1968 that you had to go in hiding? And who are you hiding from in 1968?
Response. I went into hiding after the general movement already gained its momentum. People went to the jungle and there were rumors about this movement. So teachers, school teachers who were interested in this, who was interested in this movement could never remain exposed to the public when their intention was known to the Londoner's people, so they had to go in hiding.
Do you share Mr. Short's analysis when he states that your loyalty to the party was being tested during those years, particularly from 1968 onwards when you were in hiding? Was this a way for the party to test whether or not you were truly loyal to the party and to the revolutionary cause?
Response. My loyalty to the party was not much known to me. I was for sure that I knew that I was loyal to the nation. I joined the front movement for the cause for the nation. I did not remain loyal for the party because the party's name did not exist as yet.
Alors, il me reste deux extraits.
I have two further passages to read from this same publication. The first is on page 152 of the English version, 0039 6452, and page 325 on the ERN French version, 0063 9780 on page 252 of the English version. The interpreter corrects. Now we're just moving further along in time, and Philip Short talks about how Pol Pot had moved to the new base. And I quote, "In theory, operational control of the Khmer Rouge army lay with Son Sen, whom Paul had summoned from the northeast to resume his role as chief of staff. His command post was 10 miles to the southeast, near the railway halts of Ra Smak, on the now abandoned main line from Phnom Penh to Battambang. It was an area that was dotted with giant anthills, up to 20 feet high, with trees and clumps of bamboo growing out of their sides. Sen's brother, Nhi Can, recounted the following, and I will quote what Philip Short cites as your own words, Mr. Witness. Quote, "We built the command offices half underground, with trenches and bolt holes inside the anthills, and a system of tunnels to communicate from one anthill to the next. When there were bombing raids, we hid inside, as though we were ants ourselves. Then, when the danger was past, we would emerge and resume our work. Usually when we built trenches, we lined them with wood and a layer of rice husks to absorb the shock waves from the bombs. But earth that had been worked by ants resists the blast even better, and the bamboos provided camouflage." End of quote. My first question for you is, indeed, whether you worked with your brother Sun Sen from 1973 onwards in this special zone in proximity of the area of Ra Smak, that is not far from Smadek in the northeast, and it's within close proximity of Udong, which is in the northwest. Now, in this border zone between Kampong Spo and Kampong Snam, did you work there with Sun Sen, as is reported in Mr. Philip Short's book?
Response. The location as indicated in the book that I was interviewed is called Sector 15. This sector is located to the northwest of Phnom Penh. It was the hottest battlefield. Bombs would be dropped every now and then. Gunshots were heard fired from the planes. Both the people and educators like me, including the military, had to dig the trenches to take refuge from these bombings. And as I indicated, the best protection was the termite mounds, and we would need to take refuge in the trenches we dug underground, the termite mounds. However, they did not give us all the protection, because some aerial bombs could also find their way to the trenches where we were hiding. And perhaps you may know that the bombs craters were visible enough from the air, and you could see them all across the country. So this is evidence of the aerial bombardments back then. Thank you.
De qui émanaient ces bombes, monsieur le témoin?
Who was dropping those bombs, Mr. Witness? Was it Lon Nol's army, or were they American bombardment?
Response. I don't know, but I know for sure at that time the fightings started between the Lon Nol army supported by the Americans. The bombs themselves emanating from any particular source or from any persons, I don't know for sure, but we saw the bombs being dropped every day. on our soil.
Tout à l'heure, vous avez
Earlier on, you said that you joined Sector 15 at the end of 1974. Yet in this passage, during the fall of 1973, you talk about Son Sen and the Anthills. Does this refresh your memory in any way? Did you arrive in Sector 15 much earlier than 1974?
Response. I don't remember all the details, but if my memory serves me well, it was by late 1973, early 1974, maybe during those years.
Lorsque vous étiez avec Son Sen,
And when you were with Son Sen in those anthills, did you see any party leaders arrive?
Response. I think the writer could have been mistaken because I was not with my brother. As a person who was involved in propaganda, I was in Sector 15, and I indicated regardless of my brothers or other army, everyone had to dig the trenches deep enough for us to take refuge from the aerial bombardments and other bombs.
est-ce que vous étiez bien à Rasma?
Were you in Rasmak, as you said earlier, which is located in Sector 15?
But response. We were on the move and we commuted between Rasmach and Chatrach.
Donc lorsque vous étiez à...
So when you were in Shrugsteck, were you yourself able to see Pol Pot, who had come to inspect the advance post?
I had never been to Trosmach. And to date, I do not even know where Trosmach really is.
Peut-être que c'est une...
This may be a matter of pronunciation, but I thought I heard you say you went between Rashmak and Shrugsteck, and now you're telling me that you don't know Shrugsteck. Perhaps, as I say, this is a matter of pronunciation, but I would be grateful if you could clarify.
Response. I was not good at geographical location. I did not know the location very well. But you asked me about Rasmach, then I thought that it was somewhere at the intersection of the railway station. But when it came to Trosmach, I had never known it. I only knew the intersection of the railway station, and I stay most of the time at somewhere near Chattarak mountain. I commuted back and forth there, but we did not reside in one particular location, we had to be on the move. So I could only recognize the intersection where the railway station was located, but I did not know Troxdijk. And as for the receiving of other leaders, I did not meet them because it was the matters dealt with by the leadership. It was not my responsibility.
Concerning the brother that we talked about, in the book extract it says that he had a command post about 15 kilometers from Troxdijk, and it was near the Rasmak railway. So did Son Sen indeed have a command position at Rasmak, which could have been rather different from the place that you were?
Response. I did not know his command post. It was highly secretive. And as for my location, it was an open place because we were in charge of propaganda, so our place it was known to everyone.
Vous avez dit tout à l'heure.
Just now you said that you reached the region between the end of 73 and the start of 1974. Now, Rasmak is very near the town of Udon. Am I correct?
Again, I did not know it clearly. I could only know that at the intersection it was called Smudge. But as for the exact location for Rasmach, I was lost.
Do you know what happened to the inhabitants of the town of Udon in March 1974?
The President. International Co-Prosecutor, can you please repeat your last question because the witness appear not to understand your question.
Oui.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. President. I was referring, in fact, to the fact that since the start of 1974, the witness was in the region of Rasmak. So, Mr. Witness, do you know what happened to the population of the town of Udon, which wasn't far away, in March 1974? In other words, a very short time after you arrived in the region.
Response. That I don't know.
Est-ce que
do you know, or at any time have you heard, at the time or later, that the town of Udon was evacuated at the beginning of 1974?
When the war intensified at that time, people were evacuated back and forth in different places. But if you ask whether or not I noticed they were the people from a downtown, I cannot recall. But of course there was movement at that time in order to evacuate people from the place where the fighting took place, in order to ensure that they could escape the bombardment and artillery shelling.
Une fois que c'est
Once these people were taken out of the combat zone so as to avoid the bombardments, were they at some stage brought back into the towns or zones that they had been evacuated from, or was their departure a definitive one?
Response. To my recollection, evacuation was on a temporary basis. When the situation returned to normal, then they would bring the people back. Because people at the rear was responsible for delivering food supplies, ammunitions and others to the front. However, if it was in the battlefield, then they would evacuate people to the rear in order to ensure their security. And of course, people at the rear provided food supplies and stuff to the front.
Est-ce que dans les villes,
In the cities, and in particular in the town of Udon, were there just people who were won over to the revolution, or did you have social classes who might have been considered as enemies?
To my understanding back then, there was no segregation at all. They desperately needed people to provide support, whether it be food support or whatever support it was. So there was no segregation as such.
dans le secteur
Sector 15, in 73 and 74, were there big party meetings that were held?
From response. In that location, I did not know about the important party meetings which were held there. But in terms of the collective meeting or open meeting of people who were responsible in Sector 15, then there were such meetings.
D'accord. Alors,
Very well. Let's turn now to the final extract from this book. In English it's ERN 0039 64 76. In French the ERN is 0063 98 00. In this extract, Philip Short is talking about the Khmer Rouge troops coming into Phnom Penh on the 17th of April 1975, and he says, and I quote, Son Sen's younger brother, Nikan, was with the vanguard, entering the city with a special zone division. And then he quotes your testimony, so I will quote that now. We moved in from all sides, all together. There were 14 different jumping off points for the final push. The main concentration was in the west. That was where the bulk of our forces were based. Son Sen divided his time between his HQ at Ras Mak and a forward post on Mount Chitras, from which he was able to watch the advance. We had expected the town to fall between 10:30 a.m. and noon, but in fact it was an hour earlier. For us it was such joy and happiness. All our strategic objectives had been met. I remember thinking how everything would change, how the peasants would finally have a better life. End of quotation. And in the book, at the end of the quote, it says, Nikan interview. So, in addition to Ras Mak, near the railway station, have you heard about Chitras Mountain, which is mentioned in this extract I just read?
Response. I was responsible for propagandizing the people, and we followed the armies because we had to proselytize people to support the army, and we of course moved back and forth between these two places. And in terms of the vanguard forces to advance to Phnom Penh, there are many different vanguard forces at that time. I could barely know the time when they advanced to Phnom Penh, but I could only hear from others, because at that time the situation was real chaotic, and I was in this place, and I also came through this Chatras mountain as well.
Est-ce que vous...
Did you come into Phnom Penh on the 17th of April 1975 with a special force division?
Yes, I follow them because we were in charge of making propaganda and education, so we followed them.
De quelle division?
Which division was it? This special zone division?
Response. I cannot recall because there were many divisions at that time.
Dans l'extrait,
In the excerpt I read out, you said that on the 17th of April 1975, the peasants would thenceforth finally have a better life. Why did you think they would get a better life?
From response. This was my personal thought because it was based on the policy of the propaganda, which was to promote people's livelihood. But what the future would hold, I did not know.
mais dans les zones,
But you worked in the liberated zones before. Were you able to ascertain that the lives of the peasants had improved? And if so, on the basis of what criteria can you make that claim?
Young response. The reason I thought so because people at the front were advancing to Phnom Penh, and people at the rear were cultivating and producing rice and other crops. So at that time, people did not have private ownership, and military forces were advancing, and those who were at the back started cultivating rice and crops. They went fishing and do other livelihoods to earn to make their living. So that's what I could expect, that the life would be better for them.
When you got into Phnom Penh, what was the breakdown of the population in the city? Were there a lot of peasants in Phnom Penh, for example?
Response. I could not draw any conclusion at all because the situation was real chaotic. People went to different direction, and they also came from various direction as well. So I simply could not conclude as to how many percent were peasant and how many percent were others.
mais est-ce que
But in a city like Phnom Penh, were there people who belong to other social classes rather than the peasant class? And if there were, what other social classes were there? If we follow the classification done by the Communist Party of Cambodia.
ក្នុង During the wartime, when fighting was going on and we could capture certain locations, there was no such thing as the class determination. We only heard that at that time people living in the suburbs ran into the city, and there were officials as well, but we could not actually identify who they really were.
Je vais revenir.
Well, we can come back to this, but in the framework of the revolutionary movement or of the Communist Party, given that you were in charge of propaganda, did you never hear about the subject of the class struggle?
ចំពោះបញ្ហានេះ
On this issue, I had heard of it, but it was not the primary issue, because what we were endeavoring at that time was to promote the livelihood of people, and in addition, we were endeavoring to win the war as well. And I was in charge of propaganda, so that was all I heard about in my own capacity as a propagandist.
Je comprends.
Yes, I understand what your role was, but if you talk about the class struggle, you're talking about confrontation between different classes. So what were those different classes that would eventually enter into conflict?
ពេលនោះតាម
To my recollection, back then there was the popular mass movement in order to establish the front. So there was no battle or fighting anymore. We garnered support from people from all walks of life. For example, I was a teacher. I had to look for teachers in order to gather together, and there was no policy that teachers were against this class of people or so, because we were focusing on reuniting our country. But later on, I did not know, but at that time, of course, there was no such thing as a class struggle then.
Pour en revenir.
Coming back to the 17th of April 1975, when you entered the city, what instructions were given by the armed forces to the population of the city?
like
For the military affairs, I did not know, but on my part, we simply put up the banner that alert people to evacuate from the place which were potentially be bombarded. As for military affairs, it was not my responsibility because there were their chain of commands.
Est-ce qu'il y avait aussi des...
Did certain population groups receive specific instructions, such as the troops of Lon Nol's republic? What was done with the soldiers who followed Lon Nol at that particular juncture?
ខ្ញុំ
What I could remember is that it was the overall propaganda at that time that we had to leave the city, but there was no segregation as such as to who should leave the city and who should remain inside.
Mr. Witness, who asked you to put up these banners in the city of Phnom Penh at the end of the evacuation? Just to repeat that, who ordered you to hang up these banners to inform the Phnom Penh population that they had to evacuate the city?
Response. It was the order from the sector with which I was. The sector had the right to give instruction to other subordinate officers, including propaganda, transport, and other tasks. So we were under the sector, so we had to abide by the instruction.
So you prepared these banners on the same day, or did you have them ready from before, knowing that the population would be evacuated?
No, it was spontaneous. I did not prepare it in advance. We actually told each other, because we received instruction from the upper authority that we had to evacuate the people because the aerial bombardment was looming. So we did not have any other special signs to communicate this message. We simply talked to people. But as for other matters, I did not know, because at that time everything was highly secretive and everyone was on alert. So whenever we heard anything, then we would take it seriously. We did not have any secret sign or so to communicate the message.
Concerning
the risks of bombardment, there hadn't been any more bombings from the Americans since 1973. So did you believe this justification for the evacuation of Phnom Penh, that it was because of an imminent bombardment that the evacuation had to take place?
Response: I don't think I understand to that point, but I had to obey the order and the discipline, and that was the movement, and we had to follow.
Est-ce qu'on a dit à la population?
Were the people of Phnom Penh told that, in fact, they were going to leave forever and that they would never return to Phnom Penh under the regime of Democratic Cambodia?
Response: I heard, and I admit that the evacuation was pronounced and that it was only temporarily or for a short period of time.
Est-ce qu'au sein des forces et au sein
And within the forces and within your propaganda unit and within the Communist Party, was there a very strong sense of distrust that intensified and that was geared towards the residents of Phnom Penh who decided to stay in this city and who were allied or continued to support the Lon Nol forces? Was there an antagonism or mistrust against these city dwellers?
Response: people were classified into two, or the situation was classified into two, internal and external. However, the slogan as advised was that all people had to be received and food had to also be offered. Whether enough food or whether people were properly received was beyond my knowledge, but no one regarded any other person as an enemy during that time. That's what I have heard.
Revenons au 17 avril.
Let us return to the 17th of April and the 2 days following. How was the evacuation organized? And how did the evacuation unfold?
Response. I already said once the appeal for people to evacuate the cities was the justification for securing the people from being bombarded by the aerial bombardments. Secondly, the appeal was done or was made in accordance with the request from the people, for example, who would like those who would wish to go to their hometowns like Kampong Cham, Kampong Thom and elsewhere. People were not forced to go somewhere they didn't belong. They were allowed to go to their places of their choices. That's what I had been instructed.
Quel moyen de déplacement?
What means of travel did the Khmer Rouge forces make available to the residents of Phnom Penh, particularly for those who were vulnerable, such as the elderly, the sick, pregnant women, children? Logistically speaking, how are these people assisted in returning to their home villages?
Response. What I observed is that there was no other means to receive them other than allowing them to move about by themselves, and if they met soldiers, they would be assisted, but most importantly, they had to walk and stop at any particular place they reached, and the situation was very chaotic, I may say.
You talk about a chaotic situation, but you are well aware that the ultimate purpose was to seize Phnom Penh. So why is it that the leaders not demonstrate more organization in evacuating the city?
Response. That was part of the arrangement, I remember. People who were in the locations, the old locations, had to be ready to receive newcomers, to offer them some food. They had to share the food. However, food would never be enough because there was an influx of people moving from places to different locations.
C'était le mois d'avril.
All of this was taking place during the month of April. Everyone knows that in Cambodia the temperatures are very high during that period, and it's very humid. What did the Khmer Rouge do to provide food and drink to those being evacuated? What did they do to provide shelter and protection against mosquitoes, malaria, diarrhea? Was anything set aside for those people during the height of hot season in Cambodia?
Response. The specific details as what you indicated was not really part of the arrangement.
Quant aux personnes qui refusent,
With respect to those who refused evacuation, because there were some people who refused to leave, what happened to those people?
Response: I saw people walking from the cities, but I never witnessed any antagonism or quarrels, because people would just obey the instruction and they had to move out of the cities.
vous voulez dire que pas
Not a single person in Phnom Penh was against the order to evacuate Phnom Penh, and not one single person refused to stay, even whilst running the risk of being bombarded.
Response: I'm afraid I cannot respond to this question because I have no full knowledge of the situation.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I wish to address another subject. Would you like us to observe a pause, or shall I continue?
The President, thank you. It is now appropriate time for adjournment. The chamber will adjourn for 20 minutes. The next session will be resumed by 3 o'clock. Court officer is now instructed to assist the witness and his duty counsel during the adjournment and ensure that the witness is returned to the courtroom by 3 o'clock. The court is adjourned.